Hello, good evening. 3 years and 7 months after the fire at Grenfell, which killed 72 people, there is real movement to help tenants who remain stuck in dangerous buildings. Today, the government announced a new £3.5 billion fund to remove hazardous cladding. Residents living in a building over 18 metres tall will have it removed without any cost to the inhabitants. But there are hundreds of other buildings that are less than 18 metres high, and those house thousands of tenants. Those residents will be expected to pay towards the cost of removing the cladding and for other safety charges. They'll be able to apply for loans, but they may be paying those back for decades. Many continue to find themselves stuck in homes they cannot sell, cannot afford to insure, and do not feel safe inside through no fault of their own. So can this really be the whole answer to what began as an unforgettable national tragedy? Nick Watt has our report.
It's just all-consuming, to be honest. There is no end in sight at the moment. This could go on for a number of years.
Lives on hold, potentially ruinous financial pressures, a familiar story for thousands of leaseholders hit by the cladding crisis.
We purchased via a shared ownership scheme here, bought 30% of the flat that you can see in front of you today. And yeah, everything was all going seemingly very well until we came to sell, and at that stage it all started to unravel, I guess, and we're left in a position today where we can't sell and we can't remortgage the flat, and so effectively we're trapped here.
Finally today, 3.5 years after the Grenfell Tower disaster, action from the government.
I'm announcing an unprecedented intervention, a clear plan to remove unsafe cladding, to provide certainty to leaseholders, to make the industry pay for its faults of the past, to create a world-class building safety regime, and to inject confidence and certainty back into this part of the housing market.
Robert Jenrick unveiled an extra £3.5 billion of government funding. In England, this will involve a guarantee that no leaseholder will have to fund the replacement or the making safe of cladding from high-rise buildings above 18 metres or 6 stories. In lower buildings between 4 and 6 stories, no leaseholder will have to pay more than £50 a month as part of a low-interest scheme towards the removal of unsafe cladding. Developers will make a substantial contribution to these costs through a levy on those seeking to build some high-rise buildings. And a new UK-wide residential property development tax will raise £2 billion over a decade from next year. Some welcome news for this leaseholder in the Olympic Park, though with strong reservations.
Here in East Village, all of our blocks are over 18 metres, so as far as we know, should be eligible for any additional funding that's been announced today in respect of cladding. I think from our perspective, the issues are far greater than just cladding. And really, I think it's widely accepted that this is a building safety issue now, and there are issues with combustible insulation, missing fire barriers, timber balconies.
Hopes and dreams bound up in properties in happier times have been dashed by the cladding crisis. The government insists it's taking a big step to right that wrong with an unprecedented intervention in the housing market. But this debate is far from over.
I think there's millions of leaseholders up and down the country who are hoping they're going to get some support today, and it's just not really happened. There's been a lot of smoke and mirrors. So the Housing Secretary was very tight in his language around the word cladding. So there's no support for wider fire safety defects. And for example, waiting watches or insurance premiums, which have gone through the roof in thousands of %. So even if you live in a building over 18 metres with cladding, there's not going to be any support for being in that building over 18 metres with other fire safety defects.
But there was strong support for the government on the Conservative benches, and one MP who's been highly critical of the government was more circumspect.
People who live in high-rise buildings will be breathing a sigh of relief, I think, from his announcements today, and I would like to thank him for those. The people that live in medium-rise blocks, I think we need to reserve judgment to make sure we examine the details of his announcements today.
A new generation of homes will rise in what should be a safer environment. But the shadow of past mistakes still hangs heavy.
That was Nick Watt reporting. The developer told us it welcomes the government's announcement and added that the East Village in the Olympic Park was built by many different contractors and say it's working with the current owners to address residents' concerns. Well, joining us now, Kevin Hollinrake, who sat previously on the Housing and Local Government Committee, and Reid, who's the founder of Birmingham Leaseholder Action Group, who are campaigning to get the fire safety issues in the city's high-rises properly fixed. She herself lives in an apartment block clad mostly with timber. So, Jenny, let me start with you. What is it? A sigh of relief or reserving judgment? Do you feel that you've won your battle tonight?
Sadly not, and I really wish we could say that. I mean, obviously 3.5 billion is a huge sum of money to go towards removing unsafe cladding, but that's really underestimating the size and scale of the issue. I mean, basically the government need to fix decades worth of cutting corners by developers, inadequate regulation, inadequate oversight, which has allowed unsafe cladding and all of these other fire safety issues to be built into our homes. So, you know, we've got this announcement of the new funding, but we don't believe that's going to make buildings over 18 metres safe, as it only covers a portion of the fire safety defects that have been built into our buildings. And let's not forget that obviously it's quite devastating news for people living in buildings under 18 metres. Because it doesn't matter whether you live in a building over or under 18 metres. Every single one of us bought our homes in good faith, did due diligence surveys, and we all have a right to be safe in our homes. And these people are now being told that they have to pay 100% for other people's mistakes and be saddled with loans, possibly for longer than the mortgage terms.
Give me a little bit of your story, because you said tonight you felt you were one of the lucky ones. You are in an 18-metre high block, so that bit of the cost is covered, but you'll still have to pay the other costs.
Yeah, just to give you a bit of my backstory. So I'm a first-time buyer. I bought my flat for £160,000 in February 2019. And then I found on later that year that we had significant issues, and I personally would be liable for costs of £40,000 to £50,000. Now, look, I am one of the lucky ones. We've had approval for funding within the first tranche of funding last year. However, we don't know where we stand with the status of that, and we still estimate that our other fire safety defects, they're going to be 40 to 50% of the cost. So I'm still going to be liable to somehow try and find £20,000 to fully fix the building. And many, many buildings are going to be in the same situation. 70% of buildings surveyed have issues with fire breaks and other fire safety issues. It's a massive, massive problem.
Let me pick up with you, Kevin, if I can. What Jenny's described is what happens when the definition of cladding becomes too narrow, because even if she's thinking of herself as one of the lucky ones, she's got all these extra costs, which are still to do with fire safety defects, that the government's simply not matching.
Well, usually the major costs relating to fire safety are in the cladding and insulation, and the Building Safety Fund does cover those elements, certain types of combustible insulation and cladding. So for most owners, for most leaseholders, this will be a solution. I think we need to take a step back. It was in the aftermath of Grenfell that the government suddenly, everybody started to realise decades of malpractice and wrongful installations had gone on in the housing sector and high-rise buildings. Immediately stepped in to ban combustible cladding insulation, and then started to put this fund in place as the scale of the problem materialised. £5 billion is a huge amount of money. It's a massive step forward, and the highest risk buildings, the cladding and external wall systems, will be remediated at no cost to leaseholders through this programme.
You banned those for exactly the right reasons, but combustible insulation, timber balconies, the lack of fire doors and that kind of safety has now fallen back onto the hands of residents or owners or tenants. And that can't be right, that these people have found themselves in properties through no fault of their own, which are now deemed unsafe. And they've got massive bills, loans that could last them decades.
Well, there's no doubt about it. Where you can find blame in terms of developers, those developers should pay for these problems. I see Persimmon today have put £75 million aside to remediate some of their buildings. So it will often be the developers or the building owners will be able to step in and remediate.
Well, let's not forget that those developers were following the government regulations of the time. Now, what you have said today is that you'll reclaim a part of this, £2 billion, through a building levy. We understand that will be payable over a decade. What many won't understand is why you don't just put that tax on now and let the developers pay it off over 10 years and let the tenants and the residents not have to go through this extraordinary heavy debt.
Well, that is exactly what is happening. For high-risk, high-rise buildings, which is, I sat on the select committee, the cross-party select committee that looked at this issue time and time again, and we called on funding of £3 to £3.5 billion more, which is what the Secretary of State announced today, to remediate the highest risk buildings.
Right.
That's exactly what's happened. It's pump-primed this, so leaseholders don't have to wait to get that money back from developers. The levy will repay the taxpayer.
But you'll see how arbitrary that is, Kevin, because when you say high rise, high risk, I could be living on the ground floor, let's say, of an 18-metre high building. I don't pay cladding costs. If I live on the top floor of a 17-metre high building, I have to pay all those costs and probably take out a loan in order to do so and face the fact of higher insurance claims and, you know, the impossibility of selling my home and all the rest of it. I mean, it doesn't make any sense in terms of where you're actually living in a building.
Well, it doesn't make a huge amount of sense because you're 4 times more likely to suffer a fire-related fatality or serious injury in a high-rise building, which are over 18 metres. That is a fact. And that's why the Select Committee called for this fund to remediate those buildings, and taking a risk-based approach is absolutely the right thing. Now, buildings that are lower in height, there's other remediation that can take place. It could be sprinklers, it could be fire alarms, or it might be remediation of cladding and insulation.
Jenny, do you accept that? Sorry
no,
to come in.
I would say that it's amazing 3.5 years on from Grenfell that actually we don't have a handle, or the government don't have a handle on how many buildings are affected and to what extent, because I think it does make a massive issue in terms of how much cladding, what issues a building has. And, you know, for example, somebody might be living in a building that's 17.5 metres and they're just unlucky that they've purchased a flat in a building that's of that arbitrary height, and their building might be a much higher risk than another building that could potentially get funding. And I think that's something that really hasn't been addressed. And also, just like you said, the narrow focus on cladding, it's so clear that the issue spread widely beyond that. And the trouble is that by not addressing that, these buildings are not going to get fixed. I mean, we can already see from the Building Safety Fund that got announced last year, 2,800 buildings applied, 5, it closed in July last year, 5 have received full approval funding for full remediation. And I don't know anybody who's actually got the funding yet. So it's the pace of this is so slow. And are we waiting for another tragedy to happen?
Kevin, can I let you respond directly to Jenny on those points?
I mean, there's no doubt the Building Safety Fund has been extended in terms of its lifespan, in terms of applications. There was a lot of applications, clearly lots of reasons why that wasn't, that needed to be extended. But of course, we want to see this done as quickly as possible. That's why the government stepped in with this money. First £200 million, then another 400 million, then another $1 billion, then another $3.5 billion. Of course, the government's recognised
that if you decided the issue appropriately in the first place, then you would know the size of the solution that you needed to provide. This piecemeal approach is not working, and it's wasting time and money. You know, a lot of buildings are having to pay hundreds of thousands of pounds in interim costs, in insurance premiums, in waking watches, while these small, and admittedly, I feel horrible saying that this is a small part of the solution, because obviously £5 billion is a lot of money, but the issue is absolutely massive. And I think, you know, it's right that you should be going back to the developers and the people who had a large hand in creating this issue to do more and act now. I was quite surprised, you know, Barratt have already come forward saying that they would pay towards a levy, but why aren't Barratt just paying to remediate the buildings directly? There's not been enough pressure put on, I don't think.
I entirely agree with that. And it's wrong that the taxpayer has to pick up the bill, which is why the levy's put in place. But what we don't want to happen, and you're absolutely right.
We're taxpayers too. And I would say that as a tax holder and a leaseholder, that's not what we want either. We want the people who are responsible for causing this crisis.
But what do we do? Do we wait until that happens, or do we step in? And that's what the government's done today. It stepped in and remediated the highest risk buildings. Of course, there'll be problems with other buildings. Of course, we need to see the detail behind the scheme for the lower rise buildings and make sure that's fit for purpose. But I don't think anybody could deny it. This is a huge step forward and pretty much the key ask for the select committee that I sat on in terms of remediating these very high risk buildings.
Kevin Hollinrake,
I mean, the select committee...
I'm so sorry, we've run out of time there, but thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you.